I didn't think much of that red envelope when I first saw it, just another HOA letter, probably some nonsense about trash cans or yard height. But then I opened it, and I realized they were actually banning me from using the only road to my own lake cabin, my house, my land. And then I saw the photos, creepy, close-up shots of me on my deck, taken from the woods. That's when I knew something was really, really wrong. But they messed with the wrong guy, because there's one thing they didn't know. Let me walk you through how this blew up. And hey, have you ever dealt with a power-tripping HOA? Drop your story in the comments. I read every one. This is QA Stories, and this one gets wild. Let me set the scene for you. My name is Tanner Reed. I'm 42 years old, and up until last Tuesday, I thought I had the perfect retirement setup. I'd worked as a land surveyor for 20 years, saved every penny I could, and bought my dream lake cabin in Pine Lake Community 10 years ago. It's nothing fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place nestled in the woods with a deck overlooking the water. The kind of place where you can sit with your morning coffee and not hear anything but birds and the occasional fish jumping. I access my cabin via a single dirt road that crosses this old wooden bridge over Pine Creek. It's peaceful, it's private, and honestly, it's everything I worked my whole career to afford. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed in the city, but then I remember why I needed this escape in the first place. The trouble started with Dolores Albright. She's 65, a retired attorney, and the self-appointed HOA president who treats our entire neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Dolores owns the biggest house in Pine Lake Community, one of those massive places with the perfect lawn and the kind of landscaping that probably costs more than most people's cars. From day one, she made it clear that she didn't approve of my rustic lifestyle, as she liked to call it. My truck gets dirty because, well, it's a truck. I play acoustic guitar on my deck sometimes because music is one of life's simple pleasures. And yeah, I drive to town maybe twice a week for groceries because that's what normal human beings do. But apparently none of this met Dolores' standards for community living. I should have seen the warning signs earlier, but hindsight is always 20/20, isn't it? Last Tuesday morning, I walked out to check my mail and found this thick red envelope wedged in my mailbox. Not sitting in it like normal mail, wedged in there like someone had forced it in with determination. The envelope itself was expensive paper, the kind lawyers use when they want to intimidate you before you even open it. Inside was an official HOA letter with the Pine Lake Community letterhead, and the first line made my blood run cold. Mr. Reed, you are hereby permanently banned from using the community access road for excessive use violations and property damage. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Permanently banned from the road to my own house? For what? Existing. I had to sit down on my front steps and stare at the letter for a good 5 minutes before I could process what I was reading. Was this some kind of sick joke? Did they even have the authority to do this? But here's where it gets really creepy. Attached to the letter were color photos of my cabin, taken from spots deep in the woods. I'm talking about angles that would be impossible unless someone was trespassing on my property and hiding in the trees to watch me. There was a photo of my truck parked in my driveway, taken from behind a cluster of pine trees. Another showed my deck furniture, shot from what had to be 50 yards into the forest. And the worst one was a picture of me playing guitar on my deck, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from someone crouched in the woods. I felt sick looking at these photos, not just because of the violation of privacy, but because it meant someone had been watching me for who knows how long. How many evenings had I sat on that deck, thinking I was alone, while someone was out there taking pictures? I wasn't sure whether to be scared or furious, maybe both. I decided I needed to investigate, so I walked the dirt road leading to my cabin, examining every inch of it. This road had always been my peaceful route home, winding through the trees and over that old wooden bridge. But now I was looking at it with different eyes, and I found fresh tire tracks that definitely weren't from my truck. Someone else had been driving on what I thought was my private road, and recently the tracks were deep and wide, like they came from a heavy SUV or truck, and they went right up to the edge of my property line before turning around. Someone had been doing reconnaissance on my place, and they'd been bold about it. The thought of strangers driving right up to my home while I was inside, unaware, made my skin crawl. Back in my cabin, I did what any reasonable person would do. I pulled out my original property deed and survey map from 2014. These weren't just any documents, they were survey maps that I had personally created when I bought the property. As a land surveyor, I never bought any property without doing my own complete boundary assessment. I spread the papers out on my kitchen table and started tracing the boundary lines with my finger, following the detailed measurements and landmarks I'd recorded a decade ago. That's when my finger stopped at one handwritten note in the margin. Northern boundary extends to creek, wooden bridge structure, private easement. I stared at that note for a long time, and I'll be honest, I wasn't sure if I should be excited or terrified by what it might mean. I started wondering, was it possible I actually owned that bridge? Could it really be that simple? Look, I'm not some perfect neighbor. My truck gets dirty because I actually use it for truck things. I play music sometimes because silence gets lonely. And yeah, I drive to town for groceries because I haven't figured out how to photosynthesize food yet. But banned from my own road? For what? Being a normal human being who needs to leave his house occasionally? The whole thing felt like some kind of power trip. And I was starting to get the feeling that this wasn't really about truck cleanliness or noise complaints. This felt personal, like someone wanted me gone for reasons that had nothing to do with community standards. Maybe I was being paranoid, but when someone's taking secret photos of you from the woods, a little paranoia seems justified. I decided to test something. The next time I drove to town, I paid attention to who was watching. Sure enough, as I drove past Dolores's house, I spotted her standing at her front window with a pair of binoculars, tracking my movement like I was some kind of criminal suspect. She didn't even try to hide it, just stood there in plain sight, watching me drive on what I thought was a public road. For a second, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but no, she was locked on me. I waved at her, and she actually had the nerve to keep the binoculars focused on my truck until I was out of sight. That's when I realized this surveillance had probably been going on for a lot longer than I'd thought. How many times had I driven past that window without noticing her watching me? Standing on my deck that night, staring at the bridge in the moonlight, I kept thinking about that handwritten note on my survey map. I folded the papers back up and put them away, but my mind was racing with possibilities I wasn't ready to face yet. I wasn't sure if I should tell Dolores what I suspected about that bridge, or let her hang herself first. Maybe I should have said something earlier, but hindsight, right? I figured if I was going to fight this thing, I needed to understand what I was up against. So I decided to do what any reasonable person would do. I started talking to my neighbors. My first stop was George Peterson, an 80-year-old retiree who's lived in Pine Lake community since the 1980s. George has this great front porch where he sits every morning with his coffee, watching the world go by. And I'd always figured he probably knew more about the neighborhood politics than anyone else. Plus, he'd always been friendly to me, which was more than I could say for most of the other residents who seemed to treat me like some kind of hermit. Over coffee on George's porch, I told him about the red envelope and the creepy photos. The old man listened carefully, nodding his head, and when I finished, he leaned back in his rocking chair with this knowing look. "Son," he said, "Dolores tried to force me to sell my land 3 years ago. When I refused, my mail delivery mysteriously stopped for 2 months. Took a formal complaint to the Postal Service to fix it. This isn't her first rodeo, Tanner. She's got a system." That word made my skin crawl. What kind of system are we talking about? George explained that Dolores had a pattern of targeting longtime residents with harassment campaigns until they got fed up and sold their properties. "She's been doing this for years," George said. "The question is, why does she want people gone so badly?" I was starting to realize I might have stumbled into something much bigger than a simple HOA dispute. My next stop was Sarah Mitchell, a local real estate agent who lives 2 streets over from me. Sarah's one of those people who knows everything about property values and neighborhood trends, so I figured she might have some insight into what was really going on. I wasn't sure how much to say, but I figured if anyone knew something, it'd be her. When I told her about the HOA ban, Sarah got this weird expression on her face, like she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right question. "Here's something that's been bothering me," she said. "Last year, Dolores hired me to appraise every single house around the lake. Every single one. Except yours. When I asked why, she said your property had access complications that made it worthless to appraise." Access complications? I didn't even know what that meant, but it sounded ominous. Sarah had this way of raising one eyebrow when she was suspicious about something, and both eyebrows were definitely raised during our conversation. That evening, I started digging. Hard. Probably too hard. I know it sounds paranoid, but something about George's and Sarah's stories didn't sit right with me, so I decided to dig into the public records. I spent hours on the county website searching through property records and HOA documents, trying to piece together a pattern. And honestly, what I found made me sick to my stomach. 3 lakefront lots near the main road were listed for sale by something called Pine Development LLC, a company that, according to the state business registry, didn't even exist 2 years ago. These properties were priced at 40% below market value, almost like someone was trying to move them quickly and didn't care about getting top dollar. That doesn't happen in lakefront real estate unless something is seriously wrong. Cross-referencing with HOA meeting minutes, which are public record, I found something that made my blood run cold. Every single property owner who had sold to Pine Development LLC had received violation notices from the HOA in the months before selling. Mrs. Henderson got cited for excessive garden gnomes before selling last spring, and she only had 2 gnomes in her entire yard. The Thompson family was written up for non-compliance with mailbox height standards before they moved out in the fall. And the Kowalskis were hit with repeated violations of community quiet hours before they sold in December. This wasn't random harassment. This was a coordinated effort to pressure longtime residents into selling cheap so someone could buy up lakefront property for development. Was I jumping to conclusions? Maybe, but I had to know. I called the phone number listed for Pine Development LLC. My heart was pounding as the phone rang, but when someone answered, my stomach dropped. It was her. Of course it was. Dolores Albright speaking, came that familiar authoritative voice. I hung up without saying a word, but the pieces were clicking into place faster than I wanted them to. Dolores wasn't just the HOA president, she was running some kind of real estate scam, using her position to harass people into selling their properties to her development company. The audacity of it was breathtaking, and I couldn't believe she'd been getting away with it for so long. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Dolores had been systematically targeting residents, making their lives miserable with bogus violations and harassment until they got fed up and sold. Then her development company would swoop in and buy the properties at below market prices. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and probably completely legal as long as nobody could prove the harassment was coordinated. But now she'd made a mistake. She'd targeted someone who actually understood property law and had the resources to fight back. Maybe I was getting ahead of myself, but I felt like I was finally starting to understand the game she was playing. I kept thinking about that bridge, about the survey note I'd written 10 years ago. Part of me wanted to confront Dolores right then and there, to throw my survey map on her kitchen table and watch her face when she realized what I actually owned. But something told me to wait, to let her dig herself deeper before I revealed my hand. Was I being strategic or just scared? I honestly wasn't sure, but I had a feeling that patience was going to be my best weapon in whatever was coming next. Standing on that wooden bridge again, looking down at Pine Creek flowing underneath, I realized this wasn't just about my right to drive to my own house anymore. This was about every neighbor who'd been bullied into selling their homes, every family who'd been driven away by Dolores's power games. And if my suspicions about this bridge were correct, I might just have the key to stopping her entire operation. Part of me wanted to confront her right then, but something told me to wait. Was I being strategic or just scared? 3 days after my phone call to Pine Development LLC, I got another letter from Dolores. This one was even more official looking than the first, printed on expensive letterhead with multiple signatures at the bottom. It was an invitation to an emergency HOA meeting to address the Tanner Reed situation. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on Friday at the Pine Lake Community Center, and attendance was listed as mandatory for all residents. I had to laugh at that, since when was attendance at HOA meetings mandatory? But I figured this would be my chance to see exactly how Dolores planned to justify her harassment campaign in front of the entire community. I wasn't sure if I was walking into a trap or a farce, maybe both. I showed up at the community center with a folder full of documents, my survey maps, property records, and printouts of everything I'd discovered about Pine Development LLC. But I kept the folder closed and just listened as residents filed in. The turnout was impressive. Apparently this was the most excitement Pine Lake had seen in years. People were whispering and pointing at me like I was some kind of celebrity criminal. I overheard someone say, "That's him! That's the guy who's been causing all the trouble." I wanted to stand up and ask exactly what trouble I'd caused by existing on my own property, but I decided to save my energy for whatever circus Dolores had planned. Looking around the room, I could see fear in some people's faces. Fear of being the next target if they didn't go along with the program. Dolores called the meeting to order with the kind of authoritative bang of a gavel that probably made her feel important. She was dressed in what I can only describe as her courthouse best, a navy blue suit with her hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look like she was about to sentence someone to prison. "We're here tonight," she announced, "to address the ongoing situation with Mr. Reed's flagrant disregard for community standards and his destructive impact on our neighborhood's property values." Flagrant disregard? Destructive impact? I was starting to feel like I'd wandered into some kind of alternate reality where driving to the grocery store was considered a felony. The way she said my name, you'd think I was running a meth lab instead of just living quietly in the woods. She didn't waste any time getting to the character assassination. "Mr. Reed's truck is an eyesore that's bringing down all our property values," Dolores declared, gesturing toward the window like my truck was parked outside with flames painted on the sides. "His frequent trips in and out are damaging our community road. And frankly, his attitude toward community standards is unacceptable." I couldn't help myself. I stood up and said, "I wash my truck monthly and drive to town twice a week for groceries. But if truck cleanliness is now a residency requirement, maybe I should upgrade to something that meets your standards." I probably shouldn't have said that, but the words just came out. A few people actually chuckled at that, which clearly irritated Dolores. She shot me a look that could have frozen Pine Creek solid. Then the other HOA board members started piling on with complaints that got more ridiculous by the minute. Barbara Wells, the treasurer, stood up and said my outdoor lights were too bright and disruptive to the natural nighttime environment. I wanted to point out that my disruptive lights were solar-powered path lights that barely illuminated my own walkway. But I figured I'd let them dig themselves deeper. Next, Robert Chen, the secretary, complained that my music was repeatedly disruptive to community tranquility. My music? I play acoustic guitar on my deck sometimes on weekend afternoons. Unless they were expecting me to schedule my hobbies around the neighborhood nap schedule, I wasn't sure what exactly was disruptive about playing Blackbird at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. The whole thing was becoming surreal. But the complaint that really got to me came from Karen Williams, a neighbor I barely knew who lived 3 houses down from the main road. Karen stood up and loudly agreed with all the complaints against me, saying my antisocial behavior was affecting community morale and that she felt unsafe with me in the neighborhood. Unsafe? Because I minded my own business and didn't chat over the fence about everyone else's personal lives? I wanted to shout back, to defend myself, but part of me was frozen. I felt completely isolated sitting there, like the entire community had turned against me for crimes I didn't even understand I'd committed. The irony was that I'd moved to the woods specifically to avoid this kind of drama, and somehow it had found me anyway. The meeting went on for another hour, with various residents voicing support for Dolores's position and calling for my immediate removal from the community. By the time it ended, I felt like I'd been tried and convicted in some kind of kangaroo court, where the verdict had been decided before I even walked in. But near the end of the meeting, I decided to make one strategic move. I touched the folder inside my bag, wondering if now was the right time. Instead, I looked directly at Dolores and said, "You know what? I think I'll need to bring some additional documentation to our next discussion." The way I said documentation made Dolores's confident expression flicker for just a moment, and I caught her glancing at my folder like she was trying to figure out what I might have in there. Walking to my truck after the meeting, I felt like I'd just survived a public execution. But that night, I received an email that changed everything. I stared at my screen for a while before opening it. Something about the sender felt off. It came from an anonymous account and just said, "I'm sorry I had to speak against you tonight. Dolores keeps a blacklist of problem residents, and I can't risk being on it with my elderly mother living with me. Please be careful. A friend." Reading that email, I realized that Karen Williams and probably half the other people who'd spoken against me were just scared of becoming Dolores's next target. They weren't really against me. They were protecting themselves from the same harassment I was experiencing. That revelation should have made me feel better, but instead it made me angrier. Dolores had created an atmosphere of fear in our community where people were afraid to speak up or show any kind of independence. She'd turned neighbors against each other and made everyone so paranoid about being her next victim that they'd throw anyone under the bus to save themselves. I could have ended it all right there with what was in my folder, but I kept wondering if showing my hand too early would backfire, or if I was just overthinking everything. Either way, I had a feeling the real battle was just beginning. I spent the weekend after that meeting doing something I probably should have done years ago. I went through every single document related to my property purchase. I have this metal lockbox in my garage where I keep all my important papers, and I hadn't opened it since I bought the cabin 10 years ago. Inside were my old surveying files, including the complete boundary survey I'd personally conducted when I decided to buy the property. As a land surveyor, I never bought any piece of real estate without doing my own comprehensive boundary assessment. It's just professional habit, measure twice, cut once, as we used to say in the business. Looking back through those old files brought back memories of why I'd been so excited about this particular piece of property in the first place. Spreading those documents out on my kitchen table, I felt like an archaeologist uncovering some ancient secret. Part of me didn't want to look. What if I'd remembered wrong? The survey maps were detailed down to the inch, with every tree, rock, and water feature carefully marked and measured. I'd used professional-grade equipment to establish the exact boundaries of my lot, and I had documented everything according to county standards. As I traced the property lines with my finger, following the measurements and landmarks I'd recorded a decade ago, the full scope of what I actually owned became crystal clear, and honestly, it was bigger than I'd remembered. You know, over the years, I've encountered situations like this before in my surveying work. People who assume they know where property lines are until someone actually checks the records. I've shared stories about boundary disputes on various forums before, but this one was different because it was personal and the stakes were so much higher. The next morning, I sent an email to the entire HOA mailing list. It was simple and to the point. Emergency community meeting requested by Tanner Reed regarding property access rights and community road usage. Wednesday, 7 p.m. at the community center. All residents welcome. I knew Dolores would try to block it, but HOA bylaws require any resident to be able to call a meeting with 48 hours notice, unless she found some technicality I'd missed, but I was betting she wouldn't. Part of me wondered if I was making a mistake by forcing this confrontation, but I'd reached the point where backing down felt impossible. Wednesday night, the community center was packed again. People were clearly expecting round 2 of the public shaming session from the previous week. I could see Dolores sitting in the front row with her arms crossed, looking like she was ready for battle. She'd brought backup, too. The entire HOA board was there, along with several residents who'd spoken against me at the last meeting. But this time, I was ready for them. I stood at the front of the room with my survey documents laid out on a table, and I could see people craning their necks to try to figure out what I had planned. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Was this too early? Should I have waited? I want to address the concerns about my use of the community access road, I began, keeping my voice calm and professional. But first, I need to clarify something important about that road. I held up the official survey map, the one with the county seal and my professional surveyor signature at the bottom. According to the boundary survey I personally conducted in 2014, which is filed with the county and is legally binding, the wooden bridge that crosses Pine Creek lies entirely within my property boundaries. According to these documents, that bridge might not belong to the community at all. It might actually be mine. Would you have dropped this bombshell immediately when the harassment started, or played it strategic like I did? I'm curious what you would have done in my situation. The room erupted. People started talking all at once, voices rising in confusion and disbelief. I hadn't expected that. I thought they'd laugh me out of the room. Dolores went pale and stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "That bridge has been community property for decades." But I was ready for that objection. I pulled out a second document, the original county filing that showed the exact coordinates of the bridge structure. "I have the county filing right here, Dolores. Would you like to see it?" The way her mouth snapped shut told me everything I needed to know about how confident she really was in her legal position. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out what this meant for her development plans. "For those wondering about the technical details," I continued, "when the original Pine Lake community was developed in the 1970s, the developer built the bridge on what he assumed was community land. But the actual surveyed boundaries show Pine Creek bends in such a way that the bridge sits on the northern corner of Lot 847, which is my lot. The creek curves around a large boulder formation, and the bridge was built at the narrowest point, which happens to fall within my property lines." I could see people's faces changing as they processed what this meant. If I owned the bridge, and the bridge was the only way in or out of the community, then Dolores had just banned me from using my own property to access my own property. George Peterson stood up from the back of the room. "I always wondered about that bridge," he said with a grin. "Good for you, son." A few other people started nodding and murmuring agreement, But Dolores wasn't giving up without a fight. "This is completely unacceptable," she declared. "You can't just claim ownership of community infrastructure." I looked at her calmly and said, "I'm not claiming anything, Dolores. I'm stating a fact that's been documented with the county for 10 years. The bridge is mine, the easement rights are mine, and you just banned me from using my own property." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see people looking back and forth between Dolores and me, trying to figure out who to believe. The meeting dissolved into chaos, with residents demanding answers from Dolores and the HOA board scrambling to figure out their legal position. I started packing up my documents, but I could feel the entire room's energy shifting. People who'd been ready to run me out of town 20 minutes ago were now looking at Dolores like she might have led them into a legal nightmare. As I folded up my survey maps, I caught Dolores staring at me with a mixture of rage and fear that told me everything I needed to know. The look on her face said she finally understood what she was up against. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out what this meant for her development plans. And for a second, I wondered if I just escalated this into something none of us could undo. But I couldn't help wondering, had I just won the war or started an even bigger battle? 3 days after the bridge bombshell, I received another letter. This one wasn't in a red envelope. It was delivered by certified mail, which meant someone was getting serious about the legal threats. The letterhead read, "Harrison and Associates, Attorneys at Law," and it was addressed to me personally. The subject line was, "Intimidating, cease and desist, property claims and community disruption." I opened it, expecting some kind of sophisticated legal argument, but what I found was almost laughable. The letter demanded I cease and desist from making false property claims and threatened legal action for disrupting community harmony and creating public nuisance conditions. The legal language was all wrong. They were citing HOA bylaws that didn't exist and threatening action they couldn't possibly pursue. Still, a part of me kept thinking, what if they really had a case? The really funny part was the signature line, "Attorney for Pine Lake HOA." I'd never heard of this law firm, and something about the letter felt off. It was like someone had copied legal-sounding phrases from the internet and thrown them together, hoping I'd be intimidated. But what really caught my attention was the letterhead. At the bottom, in small print, it said Interim Management Board instead of the usual HOA board signature. When exactly had they become an interim board? That seemed like an important detail that nobody had bothered to mention to the community. I was starting to suspect that Dolores's legal authority might be even shakier than I'd thought. I wasn't sure if I needed a lawyer yet, but George swore by this woman. Clara Hayes had helped him with some boundary disputes a few years back. Clara's office was downtown, in one of those old brick buildings that screams, "Serious lawyer who knows what she's doing." When I showed her the cease and desist letter, she started laughing before she even finished reading it. "Tanner," she said, "this letter is garbage. They're citing a bylaw that doesn't exist and threatening legal action they can't pursue. But here's what's interesting." She pointed to the signature line and asked, "When exactly did they hold new elections for this interim management board?" That question opened up a whole new can of worms that I wasn't prepared for. What if I'd misunderstood the records? What if she was still legit? That question sent us down a rabbit hole that got deeper the more we dug. Clara pulled up the HOA's official records, and what we found was shocking. The current board had been elected in a special meeting last year, but there were major irregularities in how that election was conducted. First, no proper notice was given to residents. The meeting was announced only 48 hours in advance, buried in a newsletter that most people probably threw away. Second, the vote was held during a special meeting, with only 12 people present out of a community of over 60 households. Third, no absentee ballots were allowed, and residents who couldn't attend were simply not counted. Fourth, the meeting minutes were never properly filed with the county, which meant there was no official record of the election results. "Tanner," Clara said, "this HOA board might not be legally authorized to make any decisions at all. They've been operating under invalid election results for over a year." That explained a lot about Dolores's increasingly desperate behavior. If the board wasn't legally constituted, then every violation notice, every fine, and every decision they'd made could be challenged in court. But it also explained why they were so aggressive about getting rid of people who might question their authority. An illegitimate board can only maintain power as long as nobody bothers to check their credentials. The whole thing was like a house of cards, waiting to collapse at the first sign of real scrutiny. Clara started building a comprehensive legal response that addressed not just the bridge ownership, but the HOA's questionable authority to govern anything. Meanwhile, I started receiving more anonymous emails from neighbors, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. Reading them made me feel sick. Why hadn't I done something sooner? Apparently, my public revelation about the bridge had given people courage to speak up about their own experiences with Dolores's reign of terror. Mrs. Peterson wrote about having her mail stopped. The Hendersons described being cited for excessive garden gnomes when they only had 2. The Chen family had been written up for unauthorized vehicle parking when they parked their own car in their own driveway. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. But the most disturbing discovery came when Clara investigated Pine Development LLC more thoroughly. The company had been paying the HOA's legal fees, which explained how they could afford to send threatening letters on expensive letterhead. More importantly, Pine Development LLC had received county permits to build a luxury resort on the lakefront. Permits that had been approved based on HOA recommendations that the properties were suitable for commercial development. The whole thing was a coordinated real estate scam, with Dolores using her HOA position to harass residents into selling cheap so her development company could buy up the lakefront for a resort project. At what point would you have backed down from this fight? Or was I right to keep pushing when the stakes got higher? This isn't just harassment, Tanner, Clara explained. This is coordinated real estate manipulation on a massive scale. They've been using the HOA as a weapon to drive down property values so they can buy everything cheap and develop it for profit. The more Clara uncovered, the more it felt like this whole thing had been a setup from day one. Dolores had essentially figured out how to use HOA bylaws and community pressure to force people out of their homes so she could buy their properties at below-market prices. It was legal extortion, and it had been going on for years. I felt sick thinking about all the families who'd been driven away, all the longtime residents who'd lost their homes because of her greed. Reading Clara's legal strategy that night, I realized how deep this conspiracy went. We weren't just fighting about my right to use a bridge, we were fighting against a systematic effort to destroy our entire community for profit. Clara had discovered documents showing that Pine Development LLC had already received preliminary approval for a 60-room resort complex, complete with golf course and marina. Every family that had been driven away, every longtime resident who'd been harassed into selling, had been a casualty in Dolores's plan to turn Pine Lake into a commercial development. But I couldn't help wondering about my own motivations. Was this still about the bridge, or had I started fighting just because I could? Was I becoming the kind of person who prolongs a fight just because I can win it? Looking back, I think the answer was probably a little of both. But the evidence was so damning that backing down would have felt like abandoning every neighbor who'd been victimized by her schemes. Was I fighting for justice, or just feeding my own ego at this point? Clara filed the lawsuit Monday morning. By that afternoon, everyone knew. It wasn't just about the bridge anymore. We were demanding a complete investigation of the HOA's authority, seeking damages for harassment and conspiracy, and asking the court to invalidate every decision the illegitimate board had made over the past year. Clara had done her homework, and the case she built was airtight. Within 48 hours, we received a response from a completely different law firm. Apparently, the previous attorney had dropped the HOA as clients faster than you could say malpractice lawsuit. That told me everything I needed to know about how strong our case really was. The new attorney was a professional who immediately understood how weak the HOA's position was. He tried to negotiate a settlement before we even got to court, offering to drop all violations against me and restore my road access in exchange for not pursuing the lawsuit. But Dolores refused the settlement. I heard through George Peterson that she'd stood up in an emergency board meeting and declared, "We're not backing down to this troublemaker." That decision was probably the biggest mistake she could have made. Her pride was going to cost her everything, and frankly, I was looking forward to watching it happen in front of a judge. The pre-trial hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the county courthouse. I'd never been involved in a lawsuit before, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but Clara assured me that property disputes like this were usually straightforward when you had clear documentation. I'd barely slept the night before. What if everything fell apart? The night before the hearing, I kept thinking about all the neighbors who'd been driven away by Dolores's harassment campaigns. All the families who'd sold their homes for below-market prices because they couldn't fight back. This lawsuit wasn't just about my bridge anymore. It was about stopping a systematic abuse of power that had been destroying our community for years. The judge didn't tolerate legal games. She reviewed our evidence quickly, asked a few pointed questions about the survey documentation, and then turned to the HOA's attorney with what I can only describe as barely concealed skepticism. "Counselor," she said, I'm having trouble understanding your client's legal basis for disputing a county-felled survey that's been on record for 10 years. The attorney tried to argue that the bridge had been treated as community property for decades, but the judge cut him off. Treatment and legal ownership are two different things, counselor. Do you have any evidence that contradicts the survey? The HOA's case fell apart faster than I'd expected. The attorney couldn't produce any documentation showing community ownership of the bridge, couldn't explain why the HOA had never challenged the survey before, and couldn't justify the election irregularities that had put the current board in power. When the judge asked about the cease and desist letter, the attorney actually tried to distance himself from it, claiming it had been sent without proper legal review. That admission basically confirmed that the HOA had been operating without legitimate legal authority for months. I could see Dolores sitting behind her attorney, getting paler by the minute as her entire scheme unraveled in public. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating for Dolores. First, she confirmed my ownership of the bridge structure and all easement rights associated with it. The survey evidence clearly shows the bridge structure lies within Mr. Reed's property boundaries, she stated. His ownership is legally established and has been on county records since 2014. Second, she invalidated the current HOA board due to election irregularities. The election process was so flawed that I cannot consider this board to have legitimate authority to govern the community. All HOA functions must be suspended until a proper, transparent election is held. Third, and most importantly for me personally, she awarded damages for harassment and legal costs. Dolores and the HOA had to pay my attorney fees plus $15,000 in damages for what the judge called systematic harassment designed to force property abandonment. Outside the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief and vindication that I hadn't expected. I didn't cheer, I just let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Clara said, "Cases like this rarely end clean. Maybe we got lucky." But the most satisfying moment came when George Peterson walked over and shook my hand. "Son," he said, "you just liberated this entire neighborhood." Behind him, I could see Sarah Mitchell talking to a group of neighbors who'd come to support me. For the first time in months, people looked relaxed and happy, instead of worried about what Dolores might do next. It felt like a weight had been lifted off the entire community. The community rallied, neighbors thanked me, people were staying instead of fleeing. The Henderson family stopped by to tell me they were taking their house off the market. They'd been planning to move because of the harassment, but now they wanted to stay. Sarah Mitchell reported that 3 other families had also decided not to sell, and property inquiries from outsiders had increased significantly. Apparently, word was getting around that Pine Lake was no longer under the thumb of a tyrannical HOA, and people were interested in living in a community where they could actually enjoy their homes without fear. But even in victory, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that this was either the perfect ending to our community's problems or just the calm before an even bigger storm. Dolores had been planning that resort development for years, and losing the HOA lawsuit was probably just a setback, not a defeat. She still owned her development company, she still had connections in the county planning office, and she definitely still had the motivation to find another way to get what she wanted. Standing in my kitchen that night, reading all the thank you notes and feeling the satisfaction of complete legal victory, I wondered if I was celebrating too early, or if I was just overthinking a battle that was finally truly over. 2 weeks after the court ruling, Dolores made one last desperate attempt to maintain some kind of control over the situation. She sent out letters calling for an emergency appeal meeting to rally residents against the court decision and organize what she called community resistance to judicial overreach. I had to admire her persistence, even though her legal position was completely hopeless. She called it crucial for community value. It sounded more like a revolution. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday at the community center, and I decided to see how this final act would play out. I drove over to the community center that evening. From my truck in the parking lot, I could see through the windows that only 2 people had shown up, both recent newcomers who probably didn't understand the full situation yet. Even Dolores's former allies had completely abandoned her. The sight of that nearly empty room was almost sad. Here was someone who'd spent years terrorizing her neighbors, and when she finally needed community support, absolutely nobody was willing to stand with her. I watched for about 10 minutes as Dolores tried to give her presentation to an audience of 2 confused-looking people. Then I drove home. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting someone dig their own grave. Within a month, the consequences of Dolores's actions caught up with her completely. The The $15,000 judgment, combined with her legal fees from multiple attorneys, forced her to put her house on the market. But here's the beautiful irony. The property values in Pine Lake had actually increased since the HOA corruption scandal became public knowledge. Apparently, people were willing to pay extra to live in a community that had successfully fought off tyrannical leadership. Dolores ended up having to sell her house for significantly less than its appraised value because word had gotten around about her role in the harassment campaigns, and nobody wanted to buy from someone with that kind of reputation. Even in a good market, karma catches up. The most satisfying twist came when I learned who bought Dolores's house. It turned out that 5 families in the neighborhood had pooled their money to purchase the property together, specifically to ensure that no one like Dolores could move in and try to restart the same kind of power games. They converted part of it into a community meeting space and rented out the rest to a nice family with kids who actually wanted to be part of a friendly neighborhood. George Peterson told me it was the most cooperative thing he'd seen neighbors do in 40 years of living in Pine Lake. Sometimes the best solutions come from people working together instead of fighting each other. Pine Development LLC dissolved within 6 weeks of the court ruling. Once their scheme was exposed and they lost their HOA leverage, the whole resort development plan fell apart. The county revoked their preliminary permits after investigating the HOA corruption allegations, and several families who'd been pressured into selling their properties actually got their contracts voided due to fraud concerns. It turned out that real estate scams don't work very well when everyone knows they're scams and has legal protection against them. The entire lakefront that Dolores had been trying to acquire for development was back in the hands of people who actually wanted to live there. Instead of celebrating my victory with some kind of private gloating session, I decided to do something that felt more productive. I organized what I called a community rebuilding meeting at the community center, and the turnout was incredible. Nearly every household in Pine Lake showed up, including families who'd been too intimidated to participate in community events during Dolores's reign. People were actually excited about the possibility of having a functional, cooperative HOA that focused on genuine community improvement instead of harassment and intimidation. The energy in that room was completely different from the tense, fearful atmosphere of the previous months. George Peterson and Sarah Mitchell volunteered to lead the new HOA with completely transparent operations. Every decision would require a public vote, meeting minutes would be posted online within 24 hours, and the focus would be on actual community improvement rather than petty control games. No more secret violation notices, no more pressure tactics, and definitely no more surveillance photos taken from hiding spots in the woods. It was refreshing to see people talking about things like community gardens and neighborhood barbecues instead of arguing about truck cleanliness and mailbox height standards. This was what community leadership was supposed to look like. A month later, I hosted a ceremony on my bridge. People signed what I called a Neighbor Respect Charter. A simple document promising to treat each other fairly and resolve conflicts through honest conversation rather than intimidation tactics. This bridge taught me something, I told the group of neighbors gathered on the wooden structure. It's not about who owns what, it's about how we choose to connect with each other. I know that sounds a little cheesy, but after everything we'd been through, it felt important to mark the transition from conflict to cooperation with something positive and community-femate. Standing on that bridge after everyone went home, I reflected on the entire experience and what it had taught me about standing up to bullies. 6 months earlier, I'd thought this was just about defending my right to drive to my own house. But looking back, I realized this was never really about property rights or HOA bylaws. This was about what happens when good people stay silent while bullies take control, and what's possible when someone finally says enough and fights back. With the right combination of evidence, strategy, and community support, sometimes the fights we don't want to have are the ones we most need to win. 6 months later, Pine Lake community had become known throughout the county as a model neighborhood. Turns out, people like living where they're not afraid of their neighbors, and the new HOA was actually focused on things that improved everyone's quality of life. Families used my bridge daily to visit each other, kids played in the creek underneath it, and I'd somehow become the unofficial neighborhood mediator when minor disputes came up. It was funny how owning the bridge had made me more connected to the community rather than more isolated from it. People weren't afraid to talk to each other anymore, which made everything better. Dolores moved to a retirement community in Arizona, and her last act was leaving scathing reviews of Pine Lake on several real estate websites. But the reviews were so obviously bitter and vindictive that they actually made our community look better by comparison. People reading them could tell immediately that they came from someone with a personal grudge, rather than legitimate concerns about the neighborhood. Even in defeat, she was still helping us by showing potential residents exactly the kind of person we'd successfully gotten rid of. I kept legal ownership of that bridge, not as a symbol of power over my neighbors, but as a reminder that sometimes standing up to bullies benefits everyone, even the people who were too scared to stand up themselves. Turns out, building something beats winning. Watching families cross my bridge to attend community events, seeing kids play safely in a neighborhood where parents don't have to worry about arbitrary harassment, and knowing that people can enjoy their homes without fear of petty retaliation made every moment of the legal battle worth it. As the sun set over Pine Lake that evening, I stood there holding that letter from Arizona, still sealed, still heavy with whatever Dolores thought she needed to say. Part of me wants to open it. Part of me thinks, what for? Some things are better left unread. Or maybe it's just one last game she's playing, even from 1,000 miles away. Either way, thanks for sticking with me through this ride. If you've ever faced off against a petty HOA or wondered what you'd do if you had to, share it in the comments. Hit like if this story gave you that sweet taste of justice, and don't forget to subscribe to QA Stories for more tales that hit just the right nerve.
Appreciate you sticking with us at QA Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment, because things only get crazier from here.